Welcome to J Lowe Artist YouTube channel. Today we're doing watercolors on 300 series cold press illustration board. It's a lot of fun, it's good practice, and we'll be learning some techniques of just direct painting. Nothing really advanced or anything, but it's good practice. So come on along and do some painting with us. And remember, art makes life better.
So when you're doing any kind of water paint, this what we're using here is 300 series cold press illustration board. And remember, there's two sides to this. The back side is gray, or sometimes it'll say the word crescent or something on the back. The back side's gray. The white side is white. That's the side we want to do it on. This technique is a little different. So what you want to do, just to have everything ready for us, you want a couple of drops of water in each of your colors. And it doesn't take a lot of paint. That is one thing that most people err in, is they use too much paint. One thing you want to remember is that when you're painting with water paint, because water is, gravity affects water, never put your brush anywhere if it's wet. If I were painting along and it had paint in it and I think, oh, I need some blue, and I was just painting yellow, and I stick it in there, what's going to happen to my blue? Yeah, it's going to go out into my paint. So always use a dry brush when you're dipping either in the water or into the paint. It should mostly be dry. Otherwise, your paints are going to mess up. And you don't want your paints to mess up. Let's first start out with getting our composition. There's two ways of thinking about this. We can take our pencil and we can draw on it and figure out where our mountains and our trees and things are. Or we can take water paint pencils, these watercolor pencils. This is paint. If you get these pencils wet, they become paint. So that's another thing you can do. I rarely use black, but every now and then it's necessary to use black. I'm going to start out with violet. You can either do this in blue as well. It's kind of up to you. But I am going to draw in, using watercolor pencils, whatever it is that I need. So I've got some mountain over here, kind of comes up here. And you can barely see what I'm doing. I am drawing lightly. So just go ahead and take a minute to draw in some of the areas that you want to have in your painting. You don't have to do the entire scene either. You can say, well, I want to just do like the reflection of the pond and the mountains. I want to leave some of that yellow out that's in there. It's totally up to you. You are the composers. You've got to compose this to where you're happy with it. So I'm going to try to draw just a little heavier, and I'm just using the side of my pencil. And I'm just drawing in some of the darker areas with the side of my pencil as quickly as I can. Remember, if you're outside doing plein air, you want to get this done. Here's a pine tree. I like these trees on the end, so maybe just a few little trees coming up towards the end. That kind of gives me a border or a way of kind of framing things. I also like these pine trees over on this side. These are a little different kinds of trees. These look more like your lodgepole pines. whereas the others might look more like a pinyon pine. Or this is just the purple. Now, I know that if I put green in with this, it's going to turn a little darker. Or yellow or orange. This is why I like the purple. It can do a lot of different things. No, this part here is the little trees along the edge. This is the shadow of those trees. I'm probably not going to draw the reflection because I can do that with paint. And this is, again, going to be the wet on wet techniques because we want it to be very fuzzy. Want it to be soft, not strong contrast. Here in the mountain, we can get some stronger contrasts. So I can go in and draw those in as well. I can do this entire scene if I wanted to with these watercolor pencils, but that's a little slower. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to try to do a little mixture of both watercolor pencils and the paint. And if you've noticed, there is no white paint in your color sets. So how are we going to get white? That's right, you just leave it out. What if you make your mountains a different shape? Does anybody any care? No. Unless you're drawing a portrait of the mountains, being specific. So just relax. Just get some darks and lights, and if it's not perfect, that's okay. Why do people do art anyway? How come you guys are doing art? Because it's a college credit? True, but it should be for yourself. You should be doing it for your own enjoyment, relaxation, whatever it is. Art should be personal. It should be for yourself. All I'm doing is trying to get in the darkest areas, the dark shadows, and that's going to help me figure out where everything goes. And technically, I'm just scribbling. I mean, I'm not really thinking trees. I'm thinking darks and lights. That's all. I guess you could draw a little bit of the highlight or the shadows in the reflections. Just so that you can kind of give you a map of what you're going to be painting. As you do reflections, though, if you're doing reflections in the water, think about going side to side and very horizontal, because that's the way water lays, and all your ripples and everything are going to be very horizontal. Okay, again, you really don't want to spend a lot of time on your drawing. But sometimes I like to just have two brushes. One that, I mean, I'd never paint with this brush. It's a terrible brush, but it's nice to get water. So when you're doing the wet on wet technique, and we're looking at the sky here, notice the sky over here is lighter. It's always lighter closer to the horizon as well. And if you've got any clouds, like there's a few wispy clouds, I may think to myself, oh, wish there were more clouds in there. I may want some of those clouds in there as well. So as I paint, I'm going to leave the clouds out. But if it's wet, it's going to fuzz out and give you nice, soft, fuzzy edges. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint just the horizon with water. So I'm going to dip this in while it's nice and wet and or nice and clean. And I'm just going to do water in the background. Just water. Pure water. And you want it pretty wet. Not necessarily drippy wet, but you want it pretty wet. I'm trying to avoid some of those taller trees because that is water paint. This is just drippy water, just water. Ask that question again. Why are you getting it wet?
It's just the light.
Oh, it's just the shine on it. I like that so you can see where I'm doing it. Notice I'm not doing into the clouds. And while it's nice and wet, I'm going to just take some blue. And you only use about 1/4 inch of paint on your brush. You don't want much. I'm going to start from the top and work my way down. And notice what happens to it. See how it starts to drip and fade in there? It's nice and smooth. But if you think to yourself, oh, I want some clouds in there, just leave them out. You just go in and you just dabble it around. There's some clouds. There's a happy little cloud right there. Maybe there's another little cloud kind of floating back in there. Just let it do its thing, though. As it fuzzes and the paint kind of does its thing, it just does its whatever it's doing. Don't force it. Also, most of that pigment is starting to come off my brush. And you kind of want that. You want that pigment to kind of fade in. Because as you get closer to your horizon, it's going to get lighter. And you want that to happen. So all the pigment, I'm trying to get most of the pigment off my brush. There's not a lot of paint there. Also, don't be too concerned if you think, oh, that's darker than I want it, because your paint dries a little bit darker than you, or dries lighter than you think it should. And when it's wet, you can just dabble it in. I'm not rubbing it, I'm just touching it and letting it do its thing. If it's not wet enough, it's not going to do that. And you really want to work fairly quickly because it will dry. Here in this dry air, this stuff dries very quickly. I'm just kind of dabbling it, just kind of touching it. Let me see if I can get rid of some of that light on there. There you go. You can always add more pigment. Don't be concerned if it's too light. You can always say, well, I'm just going to add a little bit more pigment. And maybe you don't want it everywhere. Maybe you only want it here and there. I often think of water paint kind of like a fresco. Do you guys know what a fresco is? The Sistine Chapel is a fresco. A fresco is where you take paint and you paint on wet plaster. And the problem is that the plaster dries. And so if you're putting paint on that plaster and it's drying so quickly, you can only have a certain amount of time. So there's an Italian word, it's called giornate. Giornate is the section of paint or the section of plaster that you can paint on. Giornate means one day. So oftentimes you only get that section for a day. So when you look at a fresco, there's all these little sections and you think, well, what happened here? That's because that's what they painted that one day. And some days it was drier than other days. So I kind of think of water paint kind of like giornate. There's certain sections that you want to get done. You get them done as fast as you can. The sky is one of those. Get the sky done as fast as you can. So that's your wet on wet technique. If you wanted a little bit of dry brush in there, let's say you wanted to do some details in your clouds or something like that, you can do that with your brush without it being too wet. But don't be afraid to leave stuff out, like clouds and whatever. And if it gets too streaky, get it wet. Now you always paint farthest away to the closest because you have overlapping. So your mountains overlap your sky, and your trees overlap your mountains, and your grass overlaps that. Okay, so oftentimes it's painting top to bottom. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the mountains. Again, I'm going to do some of that blue in the mountains, but I don't want to do it everywhere. So this is going to be a dry brush technique. So my brush is dry. I'm just going to pick up some blue. You could also use purple, but since we started out with purple, and I'm just going to go in some of those darkest areas with this little dry brush. I'm just the very tip, just the end. I can paint in some textures. So here's some mountain, rock. So this is just dry. My brush was dry. I dip it slightly in the paint, and I can pick up just the pure paint. And I can say, well, I only want part of it in there. You can just dabble some of it in there. Leave yourself some little spots for snow, maybe some rock in there. But let that texture kind of be prevalent. This is just dry brush. There's very little water in there. And you notice, because it's a dry brush technique, the edges are very sharp. That gives it a kind of a detail-oriented kind of a feel to it. Anytime you want detail, that sharp edge is going to give you that illusion of detail. It also makes it look like it overlaps. So even if you came down in and you said, oh, darn it, I covered up some of my mountain with my sky, just go back over it like this, and all of a sudden your mountains will come back to being in front. And again, you can use other colors if you'd like. If you're thinking to yourself, oh, I wish I had, a little bit of purple in there. But because it's at a distance, you don't want it to be too much contrast, so too dark darks. And because it's in the distance, cool colors like blue. Things that are farther away become bluer, hazier, fuzzier, less contrast, less detail. So as you're painting your mountain, that's what you're thinking of. Okay, got to be purple or blue in the distance. And if you think those rocks are kind of a little warmer in tone, you could add a little bit of orange to that if you want. What's going to happen to the blue if you do a little bit of orange in the blue? Anybody know? Remember, orange and blue are complementary colors. Yeah, so they're going to cancel each other out. It'll become more brown or gray feeling. But you may want that. You may want a little bit of that look to it. Some of that is very warm up in there. So you could use a little purple or a little magenta, add a little bit of yellow to it maybe. So now what I want to do is, I still have a tiny bit of blue on my brush. If I dipped it in the water and just got a little wet, then maybe some of those areas I want to have light blue. Maybe there's some shadow of the snow that's up in there. So I could come up here with this very light blue, and instead of dipping back into the paint, I'm just using water. Now, it might pick up some of the purple that's there. It might pick up some more blue. But all of a sudden, I'm going to get this shadowy, snowy kind of color. And some of that is very shadowy. So this is just plain water. It'll pick up whatever color is around it. And you don't want to rub it much. You're just kind of dabbling it in there. If you rub it too much, then you'll get rid of that contrast that you've got going. So just dabble it in. Don't rub it. Just barely touch it. Let it do its thing. Okay, you still want to keep some of that contrast in there. And again, let the paint do its thing. It'll bleed, it'll blend, but you still want to keep some darker edges in there. And this is just water. Like I said, don't be afraid to leave some things out. You can always come back in later. Now that rock looks pretty cold. If I wanted to warm it up just a little bit, I put a little yellow in it, just a little bit. So that's what I'm going to do, just a tiny bit here and there. I didn't get it wet. I'm going to do this all dry. Now, if it mixes with the blue, you might get a little bit of green in there. That's okay. You might feel that way. Just a little bit here and there. I'm going to take a little bit of that yellow and put it in some of this foreground stuff too. Starting to turn green over here. That's okay. Now, last but not least, I'm going to add some more purple back into that. I know I had a little bit here, but my purple here is going to be a little darker. And this should be fairly dry. So I'm just going to go into the darkest areas and add a little bit of purple, because I want some more contrast. And if it bleeds a little bit, that's okay. I want it just to go a little darker. And that purple is going to help me do that. Hit some of that yellow and turn a little bit on the gray side. That's okay. Just make it look more like rock. Important thing is you don't want too much in there. And you don't want to rub it too much, because it'll blend with whatever's under there, and then it'll turn kind of muddy. You want some sharper edges. You want to keep it nice and sharp. And last but not least, if you wanted to, just a tiny bit of brown over some of that purple. Brown has red in it. It also has green in it. So some of that brown that mixes with the purple hopefully will go a little more on the red side. So just a little bit here and there. This is just, I just kind of got my brush wet. Whatever color was on there, whether it was a little bit of brown or it's a little bit of something mixed up in it, it'll look kind of brown or kind of gray brown. And you can use that. Just here and there. Don't be afraid to leave parts out. It'll be nice and colorful too. That's kind of what we're going for. It's a little bit of color in there. Again, you want to go fairly quickly, because you just know that you're going to run out of time. Now, this whole section here is fairly green, so I may want to go into that with some very light green. I may want to start out with some yellow down in there. Remember what happens to the yellow and the purple. So I may want to start out just here and there with some yellow, because that really light green. Try to avoid the purple, but it's really hard to avoid the purple. Any of the areas that you feel like are very light, you may want to do some yellow in there. Then I'm going to go with the green. And if you get some on the purple, that's okay. I have to go back into it anyway. Kind of hurrying this along. We really don't have a lot of time. When you're doing pine trees, especially these pinyon pines or these little conifers that goes up. I don't know what kind of pine trees they are, but you just kind of shake. Start with the top or the bottom and just kind of go up till they're kind of to a point. There's lots and lots of different ways to paint. I think the key is just get out your brush and do it. If you like what you've got going on in there and you think to yourself, oh, there's too much dark and light, just take a wet brush and touch it with some water. Don't rub it, just touch it. Let it do its thing. And it'll smooth out, it'll rub out. Don't touch it. Just be patient with it. Just wet water, and it'll do its thing. And you'll get all these really nice textures. Some darker, some lighter. Don't do too much to it. The shadows of your trees, I would go ahead and do those. You can use a brown. I'd kind of avoid black until you get to the front. Up here, you've got a lot more darks than you do in the background. So I'm going to just use a little bit of brown back in there. You can also mix that with your purple if you want. Purple and brown make a lovely dark color without it being black. Remember to clean your brush on your paper towel. Just get it wet and wipe it off. The pigment comes off onto your paper towel. Otherwise, the pigment goes off into your water and you end up with messy water. Nobody wants messy water. I'm going to just take a little bit of orange and put in there, just here and there, wherever you feel like you need some of that pop of color. You can even add a little red to it if you want to, especially over on the right side. There's quite a bit of red in there. Now, this is purple. I know it looks kind of black, but it's not. It's purple. And you can put purple in the shadows. Any place you think it's fairly dark, you can use purple. And if it needs to go a little darker, or if the purple is far too purple, add a little bit brown to it. Got about 5 minutes left is all. So you want to kind of get to that point where you think you could pause. We can pick this up again, finish it up later. Hopefully you had a fun experience today and learned something maybe, and even tried something that you've never done before. And hopefully somewhere along the way it's made your life a little bit better, because art makes life better.